Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our live briefing, Economic Statecraft and the Information Challenge, brought to you by the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. My name is Madeline Field, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm an assistant editor at War on the Rocks, where I work on our Cogs of War vertical, which focuses on defense tech and the industrial base. So this is the third in our live briefing series assessing the economic statecraft problem set as a core national security domain by defining its strategic foundations, assessing how the U.S. government, military, allies, industry, and society organize and execute economic power, and culminating in recommendations for doctrine, workforce development, and institutionalization. So these webinars are based on our 11-part article series, War by Other Ledgers, that's being published in War on the Rocks. So today we'll be discussing the information gap, or the gap between business decisions and national security intelligence, and how to close it. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Jen Buss, the CEO of the Potomac Institute, and Karyn Elliott, a strategic account executive at Rohirrim and a partner at the Five Eyes Group. Karyn and Jen, thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So to our audience, Jen and Karyn will be doing a live Q&A at the end of this session, and I promise we will get to it this time. So do make sure to pop your questions in the chat when you have them. And this talk will also be uploaded on YouTube later, so you can always watch it again. But Karyn and Jen, let's jump into it. So I want to direct this first question at Karyn. I wanted to get a sense of why non-defense industry and the government currently cooperate so little when it comes to economic intelligence. Was there ever a time when such cooperation was common, or why has there been such a separation?
I think it's really because each of those entities are laser focused on their own mission, they're focused on their own incentive structure, and they have different cultures. And if there's no impetus to bring those together, it's not generally obvious on the outside, perhaps why you would. So there's lots of muscle memory built on defense contractors engaging with government, et cetera, and you can see that happening. But the rest of it has to sort of build over time. And I think it's the focus of the government on sort of geopolitical risk, national security, and companies who are really focused on their ROI as they should be. And it just doesn't seem to cross that chasm, if you will. But in this environment where there's, I'd say, general acceptance that economic security is inextricably bound to national security, I think now you're seeing a little bit more willingness to cross that aisle. I think there's incentives for doing that because everybody wants this shared operational picture. So I think that intersection is close enough where people can see, and it becomes a compelling reason to take action, not just for some tactical, situational question answer kind of thing, but for something bigger that we argued in the paper.
Awesome. So Jen, I'm going to direct this next one to you. Your article, which by the way was great, guys, lists some very real reasons why the government does not act on such intelligence. So you say, quote, government institutions are well practiced at identifying the risks associated with action, legal exposure, political consequences, compliance missteps, and reputational damage. So what sorts of, if any, laws or bills need to be revised to shift towards a more proactive approach? How can we expand those authorities given, the current political climate?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying while policy and law can certainly be changed and would potentially affect outcomes, it starts at the core of the people. So people have this, it's a people and a culture problem, right? And I hate to blame on the word culture, but that's really what it comes to, and it's similar in the acquisition community as it is in data sharing. There's certainly things that you can share that people feel inherently risky, and that they're personally liable, and not just on behalf of the government or on behalf of their company to be able to share that information. I think it's not just from a one-to-one personal relationship with these individuals, but from a broader perspective. Nobody owns the challenge that we are talking about through this series of economic security within the federal government. So if we're looking at policies and laws, it's who can I share it with in a way from a corporate perspective, right? Who can I share this information with in a way that keeps my company safe, that keeps my IP protected to my company and not shared with others or not at risk? And who across the federal government needs access to that? So when you're talking government to government, how do I easily share the information with the people that can act on it and do something with it, rather than have the ability to continue to work in the blind, in the dark? I don't know if that answers the which policies and laws question to your point, Maddie. I think that takes a lot more deeper study. But the intent behind what we're trying to do is not going to be rooted in any one single law.
So I think building off of that, your article also grapples with a perennial challenge, as you said, whether it's across acquisition or across economic statecraft. Governments can assess risk extremely well, but are far less good at assessing an action. So Karyn and then Jen, I'd also love your take on this. How can we start to measure an action?
That's a tough one. I think mostly because people, I would argue on both sides of government and in industry, they tend to view not taking action as actually playing it safe and maybe protecting what they know. And I think because when you look at cause and effect, you tend to say, I'm doing this today. What do I see tomorrow? Not what do I see further out? It's more difficult to do that. And so if if you don't consider that, then certainly risk accumulates and it gets so large in the out years that you almost can't do much to mitigate it. So I think part of the problem is I've not seen very much at all where, whether you're in the government or outside, that when people look at a risk gain calculus, they specifically have in there the risk of doing nothing. And I think that's because it feels safe and you start there. But honestly, people should be very uncomfortable with the risk of doing nothing. It's not the safe play. You're not protecting things. You're just pushing it further down the line and making it, well, almost turning it to an intractable problem for folks in the future. So I think fixing that will start with teaching that inaction is not the safe space and being mindful of considering things that accumulate in the out years and needing to address them today.
I will build and say I have a couple of analogies that I like to use when talking about the risk of inaction. Um, and I think Karyn's absolutely right, is that people see in those corporate roles, whether it's government or industry, the enterprise role of doing nothing is the safe bet, when typically, in actuality, maintaining the status quo is the worst thing you can do. Um, if you're not changing, you're not growing. If you're not changing, you're not adapting. If you're not changing, you're not going to survive in the world today, tomorrow. Um, some of it is in the rhetoric that we use, and we hear it all the time, whether it's talking about things at home or things in the workplace. If you don't do this thing, then something happens. It's an if-then statement. And we use it to talk about daily life decisions. If you don't put on sunscreen, you will get sunburn. If you don't wear a helmet, your head could get hurt when riding a bike. And it's that there's a will versus a could that makes it a lot harder for people to um, calculate that risk that they're willing to take. There's the other DHS line that I'll use as an example is see something, say something. So it's human nature to say, oh, that's somebody else's problem, rather than go in and jump in and dive in and take action, put themselves at risk to do that action, right? And so it's the measuring in action comes down to an individual's ability to uh, their risk appetite, right? So if you go and you can take a survey on your own risk appetite as an individual, your personality trait, then we'll be able to somewhat more easily define who are the right people, the keepers of those risks. Where I don't want a super risky accountant working for me, right? I want to make sure that I can pass an audit and both personally, financially, as well as within a company. But I certainly want one that can look at gray space. If I've got a really confusing set of is a new situation, right? And so as you go to look at what is that risk of inaction in that accounting scenario, the risk of not doing anything, doing something means I'm in non-compliance. But I have to do something, and what is that something? And so it's that what is that something that we need to be able to, and this is Maddie, where the article goes of like, what is that something that we need to be able to do to help people see that the action is worth the personal risk for them to put on themselves.
Well, that was awesome. I want to turn now to some, get into the nitty-gritties. So at one point, Jen, you write that a fusion approach shouldn't necessarily be, quote, sharing classified reporting or turning companies into extensions of the intelligence community. But I could see how some of the proposed recommendations throughout the piece could feel that way. So can you provide a little bit more, I guess, detail on how that actually would work and what that would look like?
Yeah, and I'll try to paint again with some pictures. The reason that we had to put that statement in there, and Karyn and I both feel really passionate about making sure that that came through loud and clear, is because, Maddie, to your point of seeing how some of these recommendations look, like that's what we could be recommending, and it couldn't be further from the truth. So we really wanted to emphasize that by putting that statement in loud and clear. Um, what that could look like is a fused government industry. And when I say it, let me be clear. When people could misinterpret our recommendations, they could be seeing that we're trying to recommend a fused government and industry collaboration, similar to the way that China conducts some of its business operations. That is not at all, couldn't be further from the truth of what we're trying to advocate for. Um, However, on the total flip side of what we are trying to advocate for is there are ways to be able to safely share information. And there's plenty of examples around the federal government of when we've been able to do this with industry. Um, the one that comes to mind, I think we even referenced it in the paper, is about cybersecurity. So there are plenty of organizations that were responsible for collecting those types of threats around the government, and companies would recognize threats that hit their systems, but there was no formal way of reporting that, maybe more than a decade ago now. And so the government put together a structure, a whole set of nonprofits were put together to be able to share that information and collect it in a way that protected the company from their what looked like a security breach, right? That you have to be comfortable enough to say that I've been hit with a cyber attack first to be able to then report what type of cyber attack it was. Your company was put at risk, and it was probably no fault of your own. Maybe it was. Maybe your password was admin for your admin account. But in most cases now, we would say that's not what's happening. Um, and so being able to have the right infrastructure in place to share the right information is what we're going for. And that's not to say that the government wants its hands in every bit of a business operation by any means, or that the government wants to be directing businesses to make different decisions.
I might add just one thing. I think in addition to that, it's also recognizing that industry should remain laser focused on the things that are important to them, and the government should do it to them, and to put it together as a merged entity, which again is exactly the opposite of what we're advocating, would just dilute all of that. And so we would get less instead of more. And I think it's important to recognize that bit as well.
Do you think there's a world, though, where, top executives at major US companies, even if they're not entirely related to defense or strategic sectors, would be given more clearances so that they could intake this information better?
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that they would have access to all classified information. That's not how classified information works, right? But being able to share certain types of information with executives at major companies could make a lot of sense in certain situations.
Well, Karyn, turning it back to you, you detailed 3 recommendations in the piece, which we've gotten into a little bit. The first being an economic intelligence integration staff, transaction review to pattern detection, and then private-public organizations like the ones that you referenced earlier with CyberGen, sharing risk indicators. So can you please give us a few more details about what your ideal information's, sharing ecosystem would look like here?
Sure. I think a lot of this is making sure that we actually are thinking of a construct that answers the problem. What I mean is sometimes we come up with things and then we have to think, what is the problem for which we just did as the solution? And you can't quite move those threads in the right spot. So I think it's being mindful of that. I also think a lot of what we're talking about is needs to not be about throwing something over the transom. It's not a data exchange. Here you go. Here's my great business intelligence, my market insight in country X or whatever. And the same with the government side. I think it's being in a situation where you're actually integrating experts, not just information. And what I mean by that is if you have experts from industry joining with experts in government to help interpret and add color and understanding to the information that they prepare, it can better be fused and turned into a much more comprehensive operational picture for both sides so that the government can pass something back on patterns, et cetera, to certain sectors that are prioritized based on what's happening in the world today, let's say. And then those individuals can start protecting things that actually, once again, if economic security is really bound to national security, that protect American and her interests at home and abroad as well. So I think it's coming together and integrating expertise, and it could be in a rotational kind of construct. I'm not gonna, I don't know tactically what specifically that would look like. I just think that integrating the expertise, keeping it fresh, and being able to interpret both sides so it protects sort of the combined interests. I worry that if it doesn't have a construct like that where it evolves with experts coming in, it could be from capital investment markets, it could be from venture, it could be from startups, etc. I think if you don't constantly refresh it, you can kind of turn into getting a little too close to government, and that's not what we're looking for. So you need fresh perspectives, kind of like we talked about in the paper, where you can have government people to go and get dipped in various aspects of industry to bring that back and help people on the inside understand, look, there could be 5 more tools in your toolbox if you think about things this way, or look at information from this kind of organization, or have a different perspective. I think if we're too prescriptive about structure, it may be that it turns into something that's more static and doesn't move with priorities and move with the flow of world economics, et cetera. So I think it's making sure we're not doing status quo, making sure it's not just an information exchange, moving from tactical to more, let's call it strategic and partnership type engagement. So you're really integrating all the expertise in both of those functions together to get more than the separate parts.
So I think that makes a ton of sense that we can't, establish a structure quite yet. But I'm
Hey,
curious.
Mary, before you jump on to the next question, can I offer um, an example of something that I've seen in some of these conversations, right? And drive it all the way back to what we're hearing in the science communities over the last 20 years of interdisciplinary research. When you have people from different backgrounds coming to solve a problem or a challenge, they each bring their own worldview, their own set of experiences to the table, and they can see personally different patterns, or they see something different in a situation that everybody else around the table doesn't. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to share all of the secrets about the way that some I don't know the work that I did for my thesis works. That's not it. One, nobody cares. Two, it doesn't help through the conversation. But what I can say and what would be meaningful in that conversation is an abstraction of what I have learned, and be able to apply it to a new problem set. So when you have people from the oil industry, semiconductor industry, shipbuilding, right? Like you go pick your industry sector and have them sit around a table to talk about a specific type of challenge. They're all going to come in with things that they know to offer up to the conversation and offer it up as a discussion. And so I think when you think about that information sharing in a way that's not um, exquisite in the types of details that are being shared, but from a career of experience that people can offer to the conversation. I think that's really where I'd like to see the culture go to, as well as have some of the types of more explicit data that we were talking that people could imagine to be shared. Similar in the way that we share IRS information, right? Doesn't mean it's all public, but companies do have to do that type of reporting.
So I'm gonna try to nail you guys down on details a little bit more. Um, who, might establish, there's a huge variety of people that are watching this webinar now, but what branch of government should establish an integration staff, what departments or offices, just who should sort of get the ball rolling here, before, as you guys said, we even decide what the structure of something looks like.
I will take a stab at that, and I will um, ask for grace from all of our viewers as I go to give my answer. I don't think that we have the structure internally in the federal government to be able to answer that question directly. There is no one organization that makes the most sense to house this type of collaborative information sharing effort, right? It does not make sense for it to be in any singular department that we talk about today. That being said, it can't happen at a National Security Council type level because they don't have the responsibility to go take action. So it needs to be an organization that has the power to do something and make decisions and not just set strategy and intent. But it also, the powers that we're talking about, the levers that we're talking about being able to use to do the type of government intervention from an economic statecraft perspective rather than a corporate perspective, those levers come across the interagency writ large. And so if I were to able to answer the question in a very theoretical world, our government today is not set up to act in that the world that we're in today, in the way that we're talking about economic security. There are parts of it across the entire federal government, but it would take a Herculean effort to reestablish something. And it's not, I'll use the 25 years ago example of creating DHS, that I can't really find a single person that could say that DHS as it stands today is still as successful as they ever anticipated that it would be, from the get-go. So I'm not even recommending standing up yet another department organization to go do what all of these other agencies are doing on their own that are all key parts of this. Um, this is where I come and ask for grace. If I had to do it today, I would start from scratch. If I were to redraw our federal government structure by still having three parts, right? Balance of powers, all of that, but I wouldn't have the same department structure that we have as it exists. And what that would look like, I'm not prepared to answer, but I would, in essence, disestablish everything that we have and reestablish in the world that we are living in today and that we would focus on in the future. Sorry.
That was great. That was great, Jen. Um, Very complicated topic, and I'm going to complicate things further by throwing it back to you, Karyn. Are there any authorities that need to change for, working with what we have right now in the near term, for committees like CFIUS to act more proactively, or to be able to work more flexibly than they've been able to act thus far?
Well, you know, I couldn't think of any authority that we're missing that would sort of be the silver bullet to get this going. And in part for all the reasons Jen mentions, it's kind of messy and it's very difficult to wrap your arms around from a structural perspective. And government loves structure, which is why it makes it so difficult to build this thing that's a bit amorphous, and you honestly don't want to build it to the point that you squeeze all the goodness out of it. So I totally agree with how Jen discussed that last question. And I think it's similar to authorities. We also love rules, because that means it's real. And then we have structure, and all things are crazy with chaos. You can just point to,
And I
here's my
can blame it on someone else.
yeah, exactly. Here's my reason for not doing it, and it's hard. I mean, you want to put sort of a governance structure there to support activities and actions that are aimed at goodness and eye on the prize, prosecute the mission while not putting too many constraints so that this just turns into a ball of inaction or something that feeds itself, the proverbial self-looking ice cream cone kind of thing. So I think at this juncture, I would argue we don't need any more authorities. I think there are certain structures that people point to and say, this is why this won't work, like CFIUS. I mean, I think CFIUS is great from the perspective of looking at an activity that's just about to happen and reviewing that and saying, hey, is this in our interest? And how much more do we need to know about this? And what does the interagency think, et cetera. But that group was never set up or envisioned to look out in the future and say, hey, if we're looking at things that are happening in a certain sector today, what does that pattern look like when we fill it in with information from a group of people we don't generally get information about unless they're asking us, do you approve or not, which is industry. And when we get that fused picture, how do we present it back to that constituency that really is out there to do wonderful things for government as well? And so I think sometimes people can criticize organizations like that or authorities not being there, but I think it's because we build these things and then something goes wrong, and then we point to the fact that those activities that are as close as we can get to what we're trying to do don't work. And that's a reason to have inaction again. So that's a very long way of saying, I don't believe we need more authorities. I think we probably can do whatever we want today. I think it's going to be messy and chaotic because of all the reasons Jen articulated, but it is worth the work you put into it to get something that we don't have today and that our adversaries are exploiting. They know we don't have it. They see the gaps sometimes better than we do. So I think no authorities. We just need to get in there and start taking some action.
Awesome. These are great calls to action throughout the webinar, guys. And ending with our final recommendation, what sorts of products might a synthesized intelligence look like? I know you guys have emphasized flexibility, but is it quarterly reports, on-demand information sharing, using, what sorts of tools, just what would it look like for the federal government or like whatever a structure committee was set up to share information with businesses?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack. I'm a picture person, so in my head, I've painted this picture of this beautiful set of disparate information that I now have in front of me as a business owner to inform my decision making, right? But in order for me to get all of those data streams right now, um, one, I don't have access to them because it's government collected information. And two, I it would have to have individual agreements, and the paperwork associated with getting all of those data sets would be um, pretty uh, far too cumbersome to make it worth it, right? But what does that product look like? I see it as um, a a regular update to businesses similar to the way that Bloomberg can share information. You have to pay for a subscription to access that, or to have access to which companies have had um, recent investments and who was backing that investment. Um, what companies have had uh, government contracts awarded recently, and where are we anticipating a major storm happening that I'm going to need to prepare for my workforce in whatever part of the world? Or how is that going to affect my shipping lines? Or how is that going, right? So having that type of information that seems really disparate from different parts of an organization to have to manage in one place to see a clearer, holistic view is something that if I were to paint a picture of it, right, like that dashboard is something that I would want. And while that seems fairly simple for a company to provide, especially in the world of like quickly integrating different data streams, making it intelligible or actionable for the individual and for the use case that that individual is going to need to apply it to it is complicated, right? Like I don't know all of the information that I need at the time to make a decision, and I'm so used to making a decision in a information void that I make a decision anyway, whether it's inaction or action, it's still a decision that I've made. And I have to do it without all of those resources at my fingertips. So what would make my decision making better? That I could substantially say it was a better decision, even if it took me longer to make that decision. And it's hard. But we do it all the time with a lot of other things, right? I mean, we can't predict the future, and we take bets on that future all the time as an individual in your investment portfolio, as I'm gonna schedule a vacation for, I don't know, mid-October to go somewhere. And that somewhere there's always a chance of hurricane season, or there's always a chance of a government shutdown. And what is that going to mean for, but we take those risks without really having to think through them too much. And most people don't even see that as a risk, right? I'm going to plan a vacation and it's going to be wonderful and glorious. And I don't have to think about whether or not the government's going to be open and if FCC or FAA is going to be open for me to go where I want to go. Um, I, Flights are going to happen. Of course they are. As an individual, we can make a lot of these same analogies to the way that companies have to take and make those assumptions and decisions on the way that the world operates.
Karyn, do you have any more thoughts on this sort of picking winners dilemma that's come up throughout the last couple of live briefings that we've done?
Well, I think it's kind of easy to say, keep the government out of this. They're not set up to pick winners. That's not the appropriate use, et cetera, et cetera. I honestly, it's not about picking winners. It's not about putting your thumb on the scale for an individual company or an individual technology. It's about making informed decisions across both government and industry to ensure that we protect this beautiful and very effective free market system. So you're not trying to go around it or negatively impact it. You're not trying to pick a winner or influence some group of companies or even a sector. It's all about providing information that allows these entities to protect themselves, and that protects the free market system. So I think if you look at the bigger picture again and talk about the intersect of economic and national security and the fact that we want to protect the innovation and all the great success we've had with that free market system. We don't want to turn into China. Jen talked a little bit about that on a previous question, but they really are very good at looking at whatever gap we have that we can't find a way to get across and exploiting that. So I think looking at it's not about picking winners, it's about making sure that our system that abhors picking winners is able to function as it should going forward. And then we can bridge the chasm between government and industry to make sure that entities like China cannot exploit something that falls in between.
So
All
what
right, hold on,
oh,
Maddie. I'm gonna again ask for grace from our listeners and rock the world. Um, on this picking winners concept, I just want to put out there that people pick winners all the time. People, individuals, we do it inherently without thinking about it. And so the government structure and systems that we have put in place to prevent picking winners is there from preventing an individual's bias to inform every decision that is made. So the government structure that I just advocated for the last time I was speaking of breaking down completely, I'm not really advocating for it because that's what keeps us, the American public, that's what protects us. It protects our dollars, that our tax money that's being spent. But at the same time, recognizing that we are picking winners and we're seeing the government go in with industrial policy and buy stake in certain companies because we want to protect that as a inherent, it's good for the United States to have those capabilities. It is, and the free market world has let down the American public in a way, by letting that just be free market for other countries then to own and operate and fully have a monopoly on, if you use business terms to talk about it, a certain sector. And that's not overall good for the American public. And so when you talk about needing to have this type of protections in place, right, you can put it to really concrete examples of industrial policy is there to put those protections in place so that we will exist past 50 years from now, so that we're not, unintentionally digging ourselves into a hole. The other side, and I just came out of a meeting, and I'm always the person to say, you talk about the things that you were just talking about, but I'm going to use it as a great example because it's something that is on, it gets to the information point, it gets to the picking winners point, and it gets to the vulnerabilities that we don't see and talk about. So basic research, huge advocate, scientist by training, is something that the federal government has invested in for centuries and has made publicly available because it's paid as a public good, right? It's paid out of our taxpayer dollars, and so we make that information publicly available. Other countries have capitalized on the United States making our federal funded dollars publicly available for people to read and take that research, that basic research, and convert it into a technology, and then create a company that their country then has maybe different access to because laws in different countries are different than here in the United States. And they get the GDP return on them marketing and selling a new technology. So then people start to say, oh my gosh, we've shared all of this information and now it's a vulnerability more than a advantageous, proactive, good for the world, raise up the baseline for everybody by sharing this information. Now let's protect it. let's clamp down and say that the basic research that we funded, we're not going to continue to share. I'm not saying this is what people are saying, is that this is what happens or is what is happening, but let's paint the picture and draw this through that, all right, now we're going to protect all of that basic research and we're not going to share it, but it hurts us at the same time that we think that we're hurting our adversaries, enemies, competitors by not sharing that information. And so what is that balance? If you value the basic research, and so you value it to the point that you want to share it and you want to make it publicly available, and it's a good thing because it's used on public dollars. And then you say, okay, but I don't want to share it. There's this, well, then you really do find it valuable for your country and for your people. So you must want to continue to invest in it if it is that valuable. But as you go through this picking winners perspective, it really is how much of this information do I want to share? Who do I get to choose that we want to keep here in the country versus allow to be publicly available and send overseas? And it again, it gets to this point of being complicated, but it's a lost mindset on people, I think, a lot of the times that we do this picking winners part, and companies do it all the time because they have the thing that is focused in Karyn's terms, they are laser focused on the problem set. So they're going to laser focus on the things that they need most for them. That's not necessarily for the industry overall, right? And so I think that aspect of picking winners, I do not endorse doing from a government program standpoint, and choosing one as a sole supplier shouldn't be the case, but just to recognize that it is in who we are just as people, that picking winners is going to happen, and it's not always with malicious and with bad intent.
So I do want to keep.
I was going to say, I would love to see a paper just on that, super interesting. It's sort of like in 5-year-old soccer. Not everybody gets to have a trophy in life, It's just like there are winners, and that's a good thing. And I advocate that too, not for the government to do it in this instance, but I would love to hear more about that argument. It's a really good one that I think would be really useful for the community.
I just have another question on this topic while we're on it. I just want to discuss a few of the, natural follow-on effects that would come from prioritizing some people over the other, or, picking winners. So what would you foresee as a risk or a capital just effects that would come, wouldn't private industry or VCs, private equity follow companies or even the market respond to companies that are picked by the government as they have a more complex intelligence or market picture?
Not necessarily. Right now, a lot, and we allude to this. I don't think we didn't have the space or time to really emphasize it, but eh, companies tend to see engagement with the government as a risk rather than an asset. And even in this competitive intelligence world, having access to what could be what I would see as um, uh, competitive intelligence or helping me better understand the world. I don't think that it has to be a all or nothing, right? It's not that some companies would necessarily have access to more or all information than others, and some already do, right? So when you look at investors, and I'll use this from the small business programs that we ran in the past, of investors really didn't want typical capital investors did not want to invest in a company that was going after government business because it bifurcated their business process and it distracted them from their ability to go and make money in the market that they had intended to set out to. And so government investment dollars are seen as a disadvantage to the investors at that time because it's a different product line, right? They have to abide by all of these other rules and regulations, and they lose sight of bigger picture capital returns that could be coming from a broader audience or a broader consumer base. And so in that sense, the having engagement with the government is seen as a negative. So it wouldn't necessarily attract the capital, Maddie, that I think that you're getting at there. The other part to that is um, in the world that I'm envisioning doesn't yet exist, and I probably haven't painted the best visual of it, is the information sharing that I'm thinking about is not with select individuals so much at specific companies where those companies are now as picked winners, that they have more insight than others, that it is a type of information that can be shared to all sorts of companies, large and small. Maybe they have to be vetted, fine, but that it doesn't mean that the information is too closely held to single individuals at the winning companies, right? It would be much more accessible to the broader American company public.
That's great. And I do think that paints a very full picture. Another thing that I did want to get at, I know we're sort of coming up on time. Jen and Karyn, you both made clear that markets, government, they're driven by fundamentally different objectives. For the government, that can be compliance. And then for companies, it's return. But it seems that information sharing, especially from company to government, would work best when the private markets or the government might be aligned or motivated by shared interest. So what would happen in cases, where private market and the government is not aligned? So let's say, for example, Intel. Let's say that example that used in the article, that Intel was given that information about the risk that offshoring their semiconductors would pose, and they still chose to make that decision. Should, there ever be coercion on behalf of the government once, you agree to share this information? I'm going to say that you will both say no, but I'm curious why.
Uh, so no, but it's happening anyway, right? And I'll use the industrial policy example. We could talk about Intel, we could talk about MP materials and the critical minerals, rare earths, industry sector. It wouldn't necessarily really matter the example company, but we are putting pressure. The Defense Production Act we saw in 2020 go into full effect at the beginning of the pandemic to coerce and persuade and basically eminent domain, right? If you want to use a different analogy there, to go and say, no, you will go do this for me because this is in the best interest of the country. And it's really rare that the government comes in and does that because we, as American citizens, believe in freedom, and that freedom prevents government from coming in and doing those things to individuals and to companies. So can we envision a world? Yeah, we're living in it, right? Where there is coercion for companies to, if you want to have business with the government, you will abide by these rules in a way that's coercion, in a way that's just setting rules. And if uh, we're seeing it with uh both not in ITAR, what's the word I'm looking for? In export controls and in tariffs overall, right? If you want to sell to this country, you're just going to have to pay the difference. And so coercion, I think, can be more loosely identified maybe, or loosely defined to, if you really take a close look at some of the things that we're doing today could be implied as coercion. I'm not saying that it is, but forcing the hand of companies to do things for the sake of the American public is something that we've seen happen in the past. And people were not up in arms about it.
I think
Karyn, I'm curious about your take.
I was gonna add a perspective that I think when it's almost like a carrot and stick thing, when you've got this stick and you use it, then companies react, individuals react. I think a lot of what we're looking at in this space is what happens when that's not there? What happens when you are not compelled by direction of government or law or some horrific consequence? What will incentivize either capital markets, investors, companies, non-traditional startups, all those things to engage with the government in a way that they feel makes sense for them? They have a fiduciary responsibility to themselves, their employees, their shareholders, what they're going after, just like government has a fiduciary responsibility to the American people, what we're looking for, our interests at home and abroad, et cetera. I think companies and investors need to say it's okay to say what's in it for me, and it doesn't make them un-American and doesn't make them patriotic. They're doing their fiduciary responsibility that we desperately need them to do, just like the government does. I think it's looking at value proposition, not just from a dollar and cents. I think you can minimize risk by having more engagement to build that muscle memory that says, this makes sense, this is what we do, because it protects each other, and also understanding value other than dollars, like the government, super good at the sort of non-dilutive capital investment. Their IP is sort of hard problems, being able to wring out technology like nobody's business, feedback on use cases that you thought never existed, etc. I think that's real value that is not writing a check, but results in dollars sort of in the out years. And I think that's a real important partnership. And if you start having more of that across all kinds of sectors, you once again, you build the trust that you can protect things that needs to be protected, share things in a format like patterns, risks, vulnerabilities that the government can share with sectors as they come up. And then also build that muscle memory that says it's not about waiting to get hit with, the stick. It's not about consequences that are forced on me. It's about me making decisions because I see the value in a different way than merely, here's some requirement, I'll write a check, let's go. So I think that's another part of the perspective.
Also, I think that's a great place to end. That was very summative. So I want to turn to a quick Q&A. So to our audience, if you want to submit any more questions, please do so now. So I'm going to start it off with our first one. And this is a tricky one. How would the government protect itself from being garnered by profit-seeking businesses who are strongly motivated to use any new intelligence process to improve their competitive stance?
Jen?
All right, I'm gonna try to play both sides of this coin. Why do we see that it's a problem if companies are improving their competitive stance? One, right? So I'll try to break the premise of the question. Um, I think that gaming a system is the root of that question of what we're trying to prevent, and I wholeheartedly can applaud that. But that's what all of the authorities and legals and regulations that we have right now are preventing people and companies from trying to game the system. But what we're seeing is that in not gaming the US system, or in companies and individuals inside the United States, and we put our own morals and values and assumptions on what that gaming of that system looks like, we are being gamed by companies that are not US companies. They're finding holes in our system that we internally ourselves do not see. And that's when we're put at higher risk. And not just as individuals, but companies overall in the United States. When a company would be turned down by a venture investor for any number of reasons. They didn't get along with the owner, the founder, I don't care, right? Other countries' capital can come in as not necessarily adversarial, but foreign investment, and that foreign investment is not a bad thing here in this country. But when a US investor wouldn't choose to invest in a small business and a foreign investor comes in and does that, we still applaud it, right? Um, but what does gaming the system then look like necessarily or potentially in that environment where they have additional intelligence to help them make better corporate decisions to be better for the United States? I'm not sure I see it that way. Karyn?
I don't have um, another argument for that. I think you're right in reframing it. And honestly, there's risk in everything. And you're always going to have people taking interesting plays to perhaps exploit the system to the nth degree, which they can do. Maybe going around the system, maybe that's a little worse. I don't know. But we've got to have combined guardrails that make sense to both sides, and we need to protect the idea as much as the action, I think. And if both sides come together, meaning industry and government, and agree on what those guardrails are and what that is, then it's almost like, and I hate to call it policing, a self-policing thing, but it's almost if we know the intent and we know that both sides believe we need to have economic strength in the form of successful industry in the US, then maybe that ideal piece helps with those intangible guardrails.
That was great. I do have one more quick question before we close out. So we had a question that states that, the fusion center idea of intelligence sharing has been done before and it didn't necessarily end well or was a bit controversial. So could we do to prevent that from being particularly controversial again? Or what lessons learned?
Ooh, I love lessons learned. I would love for the folks who lived that dream slash nightmare to come and help with this because I think that's fantastic. Because why repeat those lessons? I think also a lot of times it's time and place. I think you really wish when you come up with something that makes sense that the world is ready for enacting that great plan. I think sometimes that's not the case, and that can also help contribute to something not working or not working enough to be instantiated into the system and keep going past an individual who maybe was setting it up, for example. I think now it seems to be the time for a lot of reasons that Jen ran through and we put in our paper and things that are happening around the world. I think this combined place that we can't quite get our hands around, defining the specifics of the who owns it and where does it sit and all of that. I think the place is today and here, and I know that's nebulous and isn't helpful from a specificity perspective, but I think sometimes the lessons learned are it wasn't the right time, now's the time. And hopefully with the lessons learned from the last time and having it be time and place today, we can be more successful.
Jen, do you have anything to add?
Uh, yes, to what Karyn said. Yes, that's what I have to add.
Well, guys, this has been a ton of fun. Thank you both for joining me. Do you have any quick closing thoughts, elevator pitches? Because I know you guys are extremely passionate about this topic. So to our audience, what are your closing thoughts?
All right. No risk, no reward. If you do nothing, that's a huge risk. Let's give it a go. We can be flexible. We can take lessons, incorporate them real time. I think doing nothing is actually accepting failure.
Awesome. Jen?
I was gonna go with something just as a cliche motivational speech of do better. in general, right? Like make decisions, be less selfish in decision making. So open your mind to other possibilities.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys again for joining me. As I said earlier, this is just the third in our 9-part, webinar live briefing series. So there will be much more of this to come in the coming weeks. So make sure to keep reading more by their ledgers. We'll be releasing those articles about every week. And our next webinar will actually be discussing Georgie Skipper's article on private capital in economic statecraft, which is going to be equally excellent. And that will be out in the next couple of days. So make sure to, look at this channel because we'll be hosting that webinar on March 25th. So again, Karyn, Jen, thanks so much. And to our audience, thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you.